Okay, thanks, Jake, for your awesome jokes. Yeah, yeah, it's pretty amazing. So I'm going to talk about high performance in the critical path. This is something that I'm interested in, and I became interested in mostly because back when I started my blog, I was just learning Node, and as most people who take on a personal project at some point in their lives, I had to have a client-side rendering framework because back then it was like the thing to do, right? So this turned out to be really, really slow, so mostly all you saw on my blog were these spinning balls. So eventually I was interested in performance and making my site load faster on the first load. So today I'm going to be trying to speak how you can achieve that kind of thing and how to make sure that it doesn't happen to you that you have like 5-second page loads. So the first thing that you need to do in order to improve your performance is actually measure what's going on and know where your site is sitting on. So there are a ton of different ways that you can measure performance. The first one is probably the most obvious. You just open DevTools and run an audit of your site. This is not very interesting, but it's probably the easiest way of running this kind of performance analysis. And it gives you some tips on how to improve performance, like caching, gzipping, and stuff like that. So you get per resource advice, and you also get some caching best practices, along with some other general tips like minify your stuff and so on. But that's the simple option, right? Then you have PageSpeed Insights, which is an online service where you can just paste an URL to your site, and it will tell you a few different metrics on how your site rates, like how is it performing in the case of mobile connections, and how is it performing in desktop connections, which are supposed to be better, and so on. It gives you some tips on the kind of things that you should consider fixing. And it even gives you some UX advice, like maybe your buttons are too small for a mobile device and things like that. So it's a nice tool to try out too. It gives you on both desktop and mobile rough scores from 1 to 100, and some practical advice as well in each of those scenarios that you should fix or consider fixing. You can always learn more going through the resources that they give you. And they also give you some best practices, like deferring non-critical content and so on, which is something that we'll talk more about later on during this talk. And then another tool that I really, really like is WebPage Test. In WebPage Test, it's basically the same thing. You just put the link to your site and wait in a queue for a machine to be assigned to you. And the way this works is it'll fire up your site, and it'll shoot a video of how the site is loaded, and then it'll give you a bunch of different analytics and metrics that you can act on. For example, it gives you the load time in seconds, the time to first byte, the time to page load, page complete, and all these different points in the life cycle of your page. And it also gives you rough scores, like in PageSpeed, using grades for time to first byte, keep alive, compress transfer, caching, where you're using a CDN or not, where you're compressing images, things like that. Besides these grades, you also get the waterfall view, which is a very easy way to look at how your page is loaded and what resources block the next few. So, for example, in this example, you can see that fonts are blocking everything else. And maybe if you were able to load those fonts asynchronously, or not load them at all, maybe because they are cached, you'll save like 600 milliseconds or even more. So it's really easy looking at this to figure out how to parallelize your downloads so that it takes a shorter amount of time. And just as you had the grades in general, you can also look at these grades on a per resource basis. So if you, for instance, have bad static caching, you may want to look at this because most of those failed grades may be due to third-party ads and stuff like that that you probably have on your site. So it's one other thing to consider. And like I said, they take a video of your site loading, and this makes it very easy to spot things like flashes of invisible text, and it helps you calculate how fast your site is loading using a metric called speed index, which is, I'll just read this. Speed index takes the visual progress of the visible page loading and computes an overall score for how quickly the content was painted. So this basically means speed index tells you how fast content is viewable to your users. And generally speaking, speed index of 1,000 or less is a good value to be in. The lower it is, the faster your page is showing content to your users. So in short, WebPage Test gives you a very detailed inspection of every single request. It analyzes TCP traffic and shows you all of these low-level things like handshakes and whatnot, and what's going on in every single step of the connection. It helps you identify bottlenecks and visualize progress, and this makes it very, very easy to figure out where in your page load you are taking up too much time. The problem with every single one of these tools is that you have to proactively go to these sites or open up DevTools and run the audit, and it's just something that you may just do once after my talk and then never do again. So this is not what I recommend at all. I recommend that you automate this stuff and you measure often, not just once after JSConf BP. So there are a few different tools we can use to automate all of this. One of them is called PSI. It's a node module that comes with a CLI, Grunt and Gold plugins and whatnot. When you use it on the command line, you shall see the same stats that you saw on PageSpeed Insights, which is what PSI is short for. And then on Grunt and whatnot, you just get JSON objects. This is pretty useful to automate these measurements and maybe make some sort of graph over time of how your site is evolving and whatnot. So it's one thing to consider. There's a similar tool for WebPage Test. It's a little bit slower because, again, you need to be put in a queue first so that you are assigned the computer where your test will run. And then you need to make another request, and then eventually, like 2 minutes later, you'll get all of this data. But it's so much data that you'll want to use it, probably. So take that into account. And then there's Wislow, which is kind of outdated-ish, so I didn't really include it earlier, but you can still automate this using Grunt Wislow. So it's another tool that's similar to the DevTools audits that we saw earlier. So what do we do with all these measurements, right? We know our site is slow now, so what can we do about that? Well, the first thing that I recommend is setting up a performance budget. And this basically helps you track the impact of every commit. because if you're enforcing a performance bullshit that basically says, okay, if my page isn't loading in a second or a second and a half, or if my page weighs more than 3 megabytes, then this build is going to fail. And if you do this, you'll ensure a certain level of performance throughout your site, which is a great thing. There are a lot of different things that you can track. It's not just page load. So, for example, you can track milestone timings like the load time or the time to the first piece of content, like a tweet, for instance. This is something that Twitter popularized, and then it became a thing. There's also a speed index, which is the index I defined earlier. This thing comes from Google, and it has like math in it. But it's pretty accurate way of measuring your performance. And then there are simpler metrics that you can use, like quantity-based metrics, like request count, page weight, image weight, and so on. And there are even simpler rules, like just using whatever YSlow gives you, or whatever page speed score you have, and whatnot. You can enforce any of these using something called perf bullshit. It's, again, a package that you can use to enforce all of these different metrics, and it comes with a bunch of options that you can use. And basically, if one of your bullshit isn't met, then the build will fail, the task will fail, and the build will fail, and hopefully your site won't be deployed because it would be less performant. So there's that. But what can we really do to improve performance beyond minification, right? Because there are a ton of different things that we can look at in the web stack, going from TCP all the way to JavaScript. So let's start with the lower levels, like networking. If you're interested in this beyond what I can talk about in 30 minutes, I recommend reading High Performance Browser Networking by Ilya. It's a very good book. It describes in a lot of detail all of the underlying protocols of the web, all the way from TCP, HTTP, HTTPS, everything, WebSockets, WebRTC, and whatnot. It talks a lot about mobile networks and why it's important to understand. It helps you understand why progressive enhancement is important, because on intermittent connections, you'll want to deliver the fastest possible experience to your users. So it talks a lot about, again, the intersection between UX and performance. But beyond that, something that you can extract from that book is how to optimize TCP. And there are two basic ways of doing that. First off, you should increase the initial TCP window size, and this basically allows you to have more throughput on every connection from the get-go. And to do that, you basically need to have the latest version of your OS in production, and that's basically it. And the other thing that you should be doing is disabling slow start restart. And this is part of the TCP protocol that's usually enabled by default. But what it does is on long-lived connections, because you're supposed to be using Keep Alive on HTTP. So on long-lived connections that go idle for a while, slow start restart makes sure that the throughput goes back to an acceptable level, and then that's not very good in web connections where you're using maybe reusing a single connection for many requests. When it comes to HTTP, obviously just make less requests, and we all can be done. Turn on Keep Alive, because that way you don't have to go through all of the handshakes involved in setting up a connection. Obviously, gzip all the text, add expires and e-tag headers, and use CDNs. So there's not a lot of explaining that's required there. And absolutely look into using HTTP, HTTPS, Speedy, and all these things, because they come with a lot of different benefits for you. Some of them are non-blocking multiplexing, and this basically means that you can reuse a single connection for the whole origin and send all of the requests through that. And it also has header compression, which basically saves even more bytes by not sending the cookie headers, for instance, when they're the same as the last request and whatnot. And there's also proactive server push, which allows you, a server to send, along with a piece of HTML, for instance, some CSS and JavaScript that's also required by that page in a header, so that the browser doesn't need to wait until the page has loaded to start downloading those dependencies. And then there's the website, right? And then here we have HTML, and the single best piece of advice I have here is just render on the server side. You can always become a single page app later, but the important thing is that you deliver your content first and not last. Defer non-critical asset loading, and this includes all the JavaScript that you have, all the images that are below default, and so on. And then there's CSS. One thing that you could do is inlining critical CSS. This basically means if this was your page and in a web browser, all of the content that's below default, imagine all of these slides that are coming up, those aren't critical because they are not loaded now. So you should be able to defer all of that CSS from the initial page load and just inline in a style tag the CSS for this page. So it loads very fast and you don't have a blocking request for CSS. We'll look at that later too. Avoid them domains and things like that. Just use responsive design, concatenate, and follow a style guide. That doesn't quite sound like something that would improve performance, but it does, because you don't repeat yourself on things like this. So eventually the code base is much cleaner than otherwise it would be. When it comes to fonts, load them asynchronously, because they are very, very expensive. You can use a fallback font while you're loading and then switch them, preventing flashes of invisible text while the fonts load. Use fewer fonts. This is something that's probably easier said than done, because it's not like you can go back to your company and be like, oh, hey, yeah, this guy at the conference said use fewer fonts, so we're cutting all the fonts. The designer won't like me. But the truth is that design works well with constraints, and if you plan on using less fonts from the get-go and try to work that with your design teams, they'll probably be thrilled about it. Probably not in the middle of the project, but definitely when it's just getting started. And obviously cache fonts aggressively using some mechanism like local storage or just HTTP caching. When it comes to images, I think the best thing that you should do is shrinking them, because usually you have like user-uploaded images that are like very big, like screenshots taken on a Mac. That are like 4,000 pixels wide. So you should shrink them, and there are tools you can use to do that. You should defer images below default. Create Spritesheets using tools, not just having your designer do that. Inline tiny dynamic images, maybe, like gravatars and so on. And you use CSS for simple icons like dots and whatnot. You should be able to live without JavaScript. I said it. Defer all of it. Use smaller modules, asset hashing, and cache vendor scripts separately, so they are cached more aggressively. So yeah, how the hell do we do all of this, right? Well, that's on you, guys. But in all seriousness, one of the things that you should be using is Nginx, which allows you to serve static content and cache it very aggressively. It supports HTTP2 now, gzip compression, all this good stuff by default, and it allows you to lay some pressure off of your front-end servers. Set up a CDN. First look into this. Maybe you don't actually need a CDN for like your personal blog, but I still set one up for mine, because why not? You can use Cloudflare if you're just setting up your first CDN. It's pretty easy to set up, but there are other enterprise-y options as well. When it comes to rendering on both the server side and the client side, there are a bunch of different options that you can use. There's a Backbone with some hacky thing called render. There's Angular 2, maybe, I think. There's Taunus, which is this thing I did that nobody knows about, so don't use that. There's React, which people do know, so maybe use that. But just try to render server side and then figure out how to render on the client. When it comes to deferring assets, just use async for JavaScript, and then when it comes to style tags, just you can set the media type to something invalid, like only X or something, and then after a timeout, set the media type to all, and that'll load the styles asynchronously and not blocking your page. Don't ask me why, but it works. When it comes to unused CSS, you can remove things like bootstraps code that nobody uses. There's this package called uncss, and you can. It's like a command line, a gulp package, and whatnot, and it allows you to get rid of all the bootstrap code that you don't use and just have like the button class. Maybe don't use bootstrap, but you get my point. Inline Critical CSS, and there are plenty of tools you can use to do this. It's kind of convoluted because the main tool to do this is something called Penthouse. It allows you to, it's a script for Phantom.js, and it allows you to look at the page and extract from a style sheet all of the CSS that's actually being used at the top of the page, and it prints that out. So then you need to take that, put it in a style tag, and defer the rest of the styles as we saw earlier. There's also a package called Critical that allows you to automate all of these things in a bit of an easier way. But it's well worth the trouble, so consider doing that. Use a font loader. This is pretty obvious. You just have to give it your font name, and then when it's loaded, it adds a class on the document, and then you can swap the fonts so that you don't have flashes of invisible text, and you maybe have some some flash when you're swapping the fonts, but it's very small. And it also helps you speed up page load significantly. Optimize images. You can use ImageMin to optimize them, to remove metadata that you don't need and stuff like that. When it comes to shrinking them, you can use Graphics Magic. It also has like an L module that you can easily use in gulp tasks with like 5 lines of code. So do that. ImageMin has like plugins for SVG, JPEG, and all the things. And it comes with the CLI and gulp and grunt plugins, so it's pretty useful. Then when it comes to Spritesheets, you can use Spritesmith. This thing, basically, you give it a globbing pattern of where your PNG icons are, and it'll give you back a CSS style sheet with all the classes that you need for your icons and a single sprite sheet. So it's pretty handy, and it also has a CLI and a grant task. When it comes to inlining images, you can use the data URI module, and it's basically either a command line tool or an API. You give it the path to your file, and it gives you back the compressed data URI for that you can just embed in your site. So that's awesome. You can also use a module system. Again, kind of like following a style guide. This allows you to not have 20 versions of jQuery. CommonJS or ES6 modules, either way, they're both pretty awesome. So that's pretty much all you need. If you want to learn more about all of these things and maybe you get your hands a little bit dirty, you can use perfschool. It's a command line tutorial thing that I did. It has exercises that you can follow that are basically what I discussed today during the talk. And it's pretty fun to do. So it has cats in it. So people like cats. And yeah, and I wrote a book called JavaScript Application Design. It has like a bunch of stuff that's it's not quite on performance, but it's on code quality and processes and automation and all these things. So if you care about any of that, then just follow that link, or maybe send me an email or something, and I'll give you a discount code if you're too cheap to buy the full price. And that's it. Thanks.